So one of the most annoying things that I always run into whenever I'm studying history, and especially when it comes to any kind of catastrophism situation, is that the Younger Dryas always comes up as an explanation for whatever evidence is ever discovered relative to any kind of a catastrophe. And it's hilarious because nowadays more and more people are being convinced that the Younger Dryas is a real period in time because they think it is being backed up by actual real science. Okay, yeah, so this is what irritates the crap out of me. Right? It's one thing to have the mainstream drift over into something like the Younger Dryas to explain a lot of the geological and other scientific evidence that really does show, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that a major catastrophe really did strike Earth. Right? At least one. Of course, we now know it's multiple, but, at least one. And it's funny because the mainstream, especially recently, has really had no choice but to acknowledge that the Earth really did go through a very quick, catastrophic period in history. It's almost impossible. It's impossible to ignore now, regardless of anything. For the past, 100 years or so, science has done everything it possibly can to ignore all of the evidence of catastrophe that exists on the planet because everybody has now been trained in a uniformitarian way. Right? So if you think in, the theory of uniformitarianism, if you're in that religion, you have to believe that everything takes millions and billions of years to happen, right? No matter what it is, basically. There can never possibly be some huge event that was on a global scale that changed everything overnight. You can't really have that. And it's ironic, by the way, because these same people have no problem believing in things like, black holes or all this other garbage mainstream cosmology where incredible amounts of destruction can happen in the blink of an eye. A supernova, for example, right? That is one hell of a tremendous amount of destruction that happens in the blink of an eye. Right? And they're there. We've witnessed them. That is insane. I promise you, if a supernova happens, in your neighborhood, things are going to change. And it's going to change immediately, like right there. I mean, that's how quick this is. Right? We know for a fact that massive amounts of destruction in existence can happen in the blink of an eye. But of course, for some weird reason, Earth is always immune to all of this stuff. Right? Earth is not allowed to be affected by anything in the blink of an eye. There cannot possibly be any way that a huge catastrophe changed the entire face of the planet overnight. Uniformitarianism ensures that people never contemplate this concept. Right? Uniformitarianism is like one of the worst things to ever happen to science. I mean, it has destroyed everything. Biology, cosmology, geology, I mean, you name it, and uniformitarianism has just So when we look at something like the Younger Dryas, it's kind of interesting now that this theory has presented itself at all. Because the Younger Dryas concept really is in the mainstream arena now. And, scientists are slowly starting to look at it and taking it a little more serious. And they're only doing that because at the end of the day, the amount of evidence we do have really does prove uniformitarianism just completely wrong. At least in the sense of our recent past, or of Earth's recent past. Like, the amount of evidence that really has been building up has shown, conclusively has proved at this point that something happened on this planet relatively recently, and it happened quickly, and it was, the destruction was planet-wide. Right? Everything was affected by it. There's really no way around this. Now, the Younger Dryas the Younger Dryas irritates the crap out of me because what's going on here is that the Younger Dryas is now being used by not only the mainstream, but especially the alternative mainstream to start to explain the catastrophic evidence that we find on the planet. Basically, what everybody is starting to use is the Younger Dryas as a coping mechanism that allows the scientist to still remain on the uniformitarianism side by and large, while also maybe admitting there is, and maybe possibly, a bit of a catastrophe that took place on this planet. But at the end of the day, what the Younger Dryas coping mechanism is doing is that it's making sure that the average person is still thinking with respect to how mainstream science still believes things generally happen. The Younger Dryas, it's a complete psychological situation. It's hilarious. If you believe in the Younger Dryas, if somebody believes, I'm not attacking anybody. For whoever believes in the Younger Dryas, the reality is I can actually prove and drill down into that person's psychology and show you that the main reason why they believe in the Younger Dryas is so that they do not have to face the facts of an entirely different outcome, of an entirely different conclusion that the scientific evidence is supporting. Because the vast majority of people on this planet are all uniformitarianists to one degree or another. Even religious people nowadays are uniformitarianists. Right? You can even go talk to Christians and stuff, and a lot of them will say, well, the earth maybe was around for, 6 billion years. Maybe every day of God's creation was, I don't know, 1 billion years or something. And maybe that's what explains blah, blah, blah. Like, that's another coping mechanism, by the way. And don't forget, I don't believe in God. I'm not a young earth creationist. I don't have any of that garbage, so I'm not pushing any of that. But the Younger Dryas is used as a way to shield your average person from acknowledging the reality of what took place on this planet. It is literally that simple. And there's no way around it. I mean, you can try to tell me, yeah, but dude, Sean, they're just following the evidence. No, they're not. No, they're not. They are not following the evidence. If they were following the evidence, the Younger Dryas wouldn't exist. There would be no way for them to even imagine such a time period existing. And this is what I want to talk about. This is what we're going to go over, because the Younger Dryas is getting annoying as hell. Every time I go and I read some scientific paper that's going over, the catastrophic evidence that they have discovered, the Younger Dryas is always conjured up as the explanation for the evidence. And of course, one of the main key components of the Younger Dryas theory is the existence of an ice age. Now, the concept of an ice age, especially the way that it is described in the mainstream, is it's hilariously ridiculous. Right? It's absolutely insane. A belief in the ice age is equivocal to a belief in a god. It is literally the equivalent. There's no way around that scientifically. And I get it, there's a ton of people out there saying, yes, but there is so much evidence for the Ice Age. All these professors believe it, so it must be true. We have so much scientific evidence that there was this magical Ice Age that it must be blah, blah, blah. No, this does not exist. Scientists and people in general only attribute all of this catastrophic scientific evidence that we have to an Ice Age simply because they are not allowed to attribute it to anything else. It's the exact same problem with evolution, right? Evolution has no actual scientific validity whatsoever, but you are not allowed to call that out in the mainstream, right? A geneticist who is looking at all of this DNA, they're looking at the genomes, they're looking at how all of this stuff is constructed. They're not allowed to come to any other conclusion other than this magically happened. Right? It has to be like that. Same with the Ice Age. The Ice Age has to exist. The Ice Age is now an established fact in mainstream science, even though it is still absolutely, at best, an idea. Right? And it's an insane idea. I've already said that. But if you find evidence, whatever evidence you find, that goes back to their supposed 12,000 years or whatever, whichever date you want to believe in, because of course mainstream science has no real conclusive evidence for their own dates, so they all just kind of try to find whatever date and scientific methodology they can that points towards a 10 to 13 to 15,000 years ago date. That's a whole other issue right there. But anyways, they have no choice but to attribute all of their discoveries to an Ice Age. They are not allowed to come to a different conclusion. Now, the Younger Dryas is, interestingly enough, born out of the fact that there are a lot of problems with the Ice Age theory. And so one of the main problems that we run into with the Ice Age theory is, how the hell did all the ice start to melt so quickly? Because all evidence shows that there was a massive amount of water action on this planet, especially the continent of North America, that absolutely changed the geological pattern across the entire continent overnight. Or at the very least, very quickly. Now, your average Younger Dryas, well, Younger Dryas might be a little different, but your average scientist nowadays will semi-agree with this. They'll say, yes, something happened, the glaciers melted, and they melted relatively quickly, but they won't say it happened overnight. They'll say it took like, hundreds of years or so before everything finally melted, but that was still a lot of water, so basically that's why we see all the evidence that we see for that kind of water action. Of course, we have to ignore the fact that the evidence of water action is on a scale that is more than just some ice melting. And of course, this is where the Younger Dryas starts to come into play. So, for example, when we look at the Ice Age situation, what they started to discover is that, when the ice melted, it must have unleashed a lot of water very quickly. At least at some point in time. It could not have been meltwater that was melting over the span of decades or hundreds of years. It just didn't work. The evidence really did show that a lot of water came really quick. So one of the things that was proposed was this magical, Lake Missoula, this ice dam lake that existed in, in their imagination, really. But there's this magical lake that eventually an ice dam broke and the whole lake just flooded out and created the Missoula flood. Right? They need to make up stuff like this, even though they have no evidence this lake exists. They have no evidence, by the way. There is no evidence whatsoever that something called Lake Missoula ever existed. It's not there. There's no evidence. We have nothing. We have zero. If you ask for actual scientific hard proof evidence that this lake existed, guess what you get from a geologist? You get nothing but cope. You'll find them saying, well, look at this water line that we are 100% positive belongs to the Lake Missoula thing that we made up yesterday. And you're like, okay, but how do you know that was there? How do you know the age? How do you know that is what created the water line? Right? This is all guessing on their part. Pure supposition. That's it. Nothing else. It's pure supposition. The problem is that they make it sound smart, so people believe it. It's completely hypothetical, and they have to create hypothetical garbage to explain the real physical evidence that is right in front of us. They have to. Right? And this is what the Younger Dryas is doing, by the way. Right? This is why the Younger Dryas showed up. Here, really quick, let me go over the basic concept of the Younger Dryas. And in fact, what I'll do is I'll cover... So there are multiple perspectives on the Younger Dryas situation, of course, because we have no evidence that any of this took place at all. And there's so much conflicting evidence that you really do, you end up with, a multitude of possibilities. And nobody seems to think that this is a problem. But here, I'll go over the two main basic sides so that, for fairness purposes. We'll go over the mainstream version of the Younger Dryas, and then let's go over the alternative mainstream so that we understand where we're at, and then we'll tear it apart from there. All right. So let's do the mainstream first. So here's the conventional Younger Dryas theory. So what these guys believe is that, around 14,000 years ago, and I say 14,000, these dates range in the mainstream. They can range from anything between 10, 11 to 14 to 15 to 16,000. It really depends on, who you're reading, because there is no real consensus. And everybody wants to be the discoverer, so they're all going to use their own dates. But the consensus puts it about 14,000 years ago. So I'll just average that out. Well, let's do this. I'd say 11 to 14,000 years, so that I don't mischaracterize the conventional concept. All right, so what they're saying is that for some weird reason, all of a sudden, around, 11 to 13, 14,000 years ago, the Earth that had been locked into this major ice age with glaciers up to 2 to 3 miles thick on the North American continent and some in Europe, magically started to melt. Now, right off the bat, it's interesting that we find a situation to where geologists and climatologists, or whatever science is involved in this, they actually had no choice but to admit that something massive must have happened to create a melting situation very quickly. Right? Remember, these people generally live in the theory of uniformitarianism, so they like to have events like this take place over hundreds of thousands, if not millions and billions of years. The problem that started to show up more and more and more, and by the way, this evidence really started to show up from like the 1700s, this is nothing new, was that concept of uniformitarianism ultimately wasn't working with respect to the proposed Ice Age theory. It's interesting. So the history of the Ice Age is a fascinating topic in and of itself, and I've done a show on that. But, when the Ice Age theory popped up, it was only created because people were trying to figure out a way to explain all of this evidence all over the planet that was pointing towards a large amount of water action across the globe. So they had no idea what to do. And initially, actually, I take it back. Initially, scientists were on the right track. They literally believed that, hey, look, this evidence shows a lot of water action happening very quickly. Maybe that's it. Maybe there really was some kind of a large flood situation, and that's what would have created what we are seeing now, right? Would have created the moraines, would have created the geological striations and the features across the planet. And that was basically acceptable for a little bit because people were still, heavily religious. But that's the problem. The concept of a flood was starting to lose its scientific credibility because it was becoming more and more difficult to try to figure out where all this water would have come from. So you had that shift from the religious to the scientific, and ultimately scientists started to distance themselves from anything that was biblical, so to speak. Right? And when I say biblical, what I mean is also on the side, all other cultures have all kinds of stories of mega ultra floods, right? This is not a biblical situation. And before I go further, I'm not talking about the deluge, by the way. But the scientists wanted to distance themselves from the deluge, because that's all they knew anyway, from their biblical writings, because it wasn't scientific. So they needed some other kind of an explanation. Something else must have caused all of this evidence. What they eventually found is that glaciers can create kind of the same concept. And they could witness this happening live, right? They were able to go up north and see glaciers slowly moving. They could track striations in the geology, and they could see moraines being created. So they put two and two together and decided that, well, all of this evidence must have been created by glaciers. Of course, the problem is that these glaciers would have to exist on a huge scale, right? Continent-spanning scale. But hey, you know what? It seemed scientific at the time, and then with uniformitarianism starting to take hold, the two just came together at the perfect time and eventually just got embedded within the scientific community, and now we are where we are now because of that whole situation. Right? So glaciers got blamed. Of course, the problem is that you really do need some huge glaciers, right? 2 to 3 mile thick glaciers that span continents. That's crazy. That's crazy. But what they did is they threw it back 10, 12, 13, 15,000 years ago, right? If you throw something back far enough in time, you don't have to deal with it anymore. That's the beauty of mainstream science, and that is how they run and hide from their problems. And mainstream alternative is just as guilty. Right? They're just as guilty because mainstream alternative believes in the Younger Dryas garbage as well. But if you throw something back 10, 12, 13,000 years ago, you don't really have to prove it anymore. Because if I demand 100% scientific evidence, of which they should have, right? I mean, they should have it. They should be able to show it to me. Right? They say, well, I mean, I can't really totally show it to you. It happened 10,000 years ago. So you just have to believe me. Like, literally, mainstream Younger Dryas people are just like, trust me, bro. That's their entire shtick. So the mainstream ultimately had to figure out how can you melt 2 to 3 mile high, huge glaciers spanning continents quickly? Like, what would it take to really do that? So the mainstream ended up kind of finding themselves in a corner because everything for them really does need to take millions and billions of years. And the evidence didn't support that. So they had to figure out how to melt the water. The best that they were able to come up with was this orbital situation called Milankovitch cycles. So basically what a Milankovitch cycle is a long-term change in Earth's movement that would ultimately affect the climate by altering the distribution and the intensity of sunlight. All right. Now this happens. Like, I'm not saying that doesn't happen. And it's interesting to note, by the way, that the mainstream actually went to a cosmological side of things to try to explain the situation. So at least they were on the right track. But of course, they have to have thousands and thousands of years. And the Milankovitch cycle gives them it gives them like 100,000 years, basically. Right? Because over a course of 100,000 years, through this cycle, the eccentricity of the Earth can change, the obliquity of the Earth, and the precession. All right? So it gives them their freedom. Right? They can say, well, it started 100,000 years ago, and I don't have to prove it, but, we can say it happened because if we rewind Earth's orbit, we know exactly what happened to Earth, and that must be what happened. Even though we have no reason to believe, by the way, that this supposed cycle would actually do what they're saying, this is just their coping mechanism. The mainstream needs something that takes hundreds of thousands of years. They've got to have something like that. Right, to build up this situation, and so that's one of the things that they use. Now, once the water starts to melt, they then say, well, I mean, once it started to melt, there was like a positive feedback loop situation. Right, there was an albedo effect. CO2 and methane release started happening, right? And if that was happening, then you would have permafrost thawing, which would warm the oceans, which would create a greenhouse, and blah, 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 blah. And then as all of that is going on, the ocean currents would shift as well, which means that, in theory, I guess, you could somehow warm up the planet if all of this was happening. Of course, we have no evidence for that, but they say that, and they can get away with it because they don't have to prove it. They don't have to prove it, right? There's no evidence that anything I just said is actually what happened, right? That's all just supposition. So ultimately, what the mainstream is blaming, well, it's funny, they are blaming the melting of the ice ages on a cosmological effect, but the cosmological effect that they are blaming all of these processes on are very, very uniformitarianist in principle. Right? Nothing happens extremely quick. It's just a regular Earth has been in its current orbit for 8 billion years, and this is just what happens. You don't have to really think about it because it's just a natural cycle. Don't question it. And by the way, cycles, oh my God, cycles. People talk about catastrophic cycles as if they are facts. We're going to destroy that whole concept in another show. I won't get into it now, but it's one of those things that just... Okay. So the mainstream, that's what the mainstream believes. All right, so they blame very, very long cosmological processes that would have melted the water, and you would get the effects that we see today. All right, fine, whatever. Now... there is the alternative side. Now, the alternative side at least goes a step further in real science, and they try to look at the problem. Well, I mean, they're more open to looking at the problem in a different way, at least. But mainstream alternative people, generally speaking, they have the exact same tools that the mainstream uses. Right? They're almost identical. It's just that the alternative is slightly more open-minded, and they're willing to take maybe one or two extra steps. So with respect to the alternatives version of the Younger Dryas, they're willing to talk about the possibility of an impact. Right? They're willing to discuss the possibility of maybe a comet or a series of comets smashed into Earth, or I should say more specifically, they claim that these comets, or whatever the impactor was, a lot of them go with comets for reasons we'll talk about in a second. But anyways, the impactor would smash into the ice sheet, and that would begin the melting process. Right? So that's definitely a step at least in the right direction to explaining the evidence that we see. Because remember, the evidence that we see is that water action happened quickly. I mean, we really do have to have, if the Ice Age was real, we really do need to have that ice melt quickly. It's got to go fast. It can't take centuries or millennia. It's got to happen quick. That's what the evidence speaks to us about. So the alternative side at least can, they conjure up a comet. Comet comes in, smashes into the ice sheet. Everything warms up for various reasons, so a comet comes in, smashes into the ice sheet. The concept here is that, most alternative people still believe in mainstream cosmology, and they still believe that comets are nothing but icy snowballs. Right? That's what they believe still. Even though all evidence to the contrary, but that's what they think it is. So what they think happened is that icy snowball comes in, smashes into the ice sheet, throws up all of this debris into the atmosphere, and apparently that would superheat the area, I guess. I don't know. It gets, this is what gets weird, because if you're going to have that much debris in the atmosphere, you would think the atmosphere would cool, not heat up. But what they'll say is that the comet impact would heat up, the initial area, and that would maybe cause that chain reaction. And for your average person hearing this sounds very smart. It sounds progressive, and it sounds like a possibility. As long as you don't use your brain for 2 seconds, this sounds very nice. Okay? As long as you don't think about it, this is a very interesting explanation. Now, of course, we immediately run into problems with this concept if we start to ask basic questions. And the first basic question, of course, that everybody should be asking is, where the hell is the crater? Because the impactor had to be significant. If you are going to melt all of that ice and create a situation to where you'll have this kind of a water action be the result, it can't be small. It's got to be a major impact. And a major impact really should leave some evidence of the impact. Now, the first coping mechanism that an alternative person will use is they will say, well, it smashed into the ice sheet, bro. There's no crater anymore because the crater was in the ice sheet. Right? And a lot of people will run away from that. They'll hear that explanation and they won't challenge it. They'll be like, oh, wow, yeah, so smart. That's a good point. That's why we don't find an obvious crater anywhere. Now, remember, we would be looking for an obvious crater up in the northern hemisphere, up there in Canada, basically. We really should see a crater of some sort up there. Now, there's no evidence for any real crater up there. Now, I know people can try to blame Hudson Bay. You can try to bring up some of that geology. That does not work upon simple observation. We can disprove that. So people will try to say the Hudson Bay might have some kind of crater outline of some sort, maybe. You can try the Baffin Island area, maybe, sort of. Other people will try to point towards the Great Lakes in America. But ultimately, none of these have provided any real concrete evidence whatsoever of an impact crater. And that's the reason why a lot of alternative people will still say that there's no crater because it smashed into the ice sheet. Right? This is why we find where we're at, because there's no evidence for that crater. So if you're going to tell me that there was a massive impactor, there better be some evidence of that impactor, and I want to see it. I demand it. I demand it. They don't have it. Now, the next coping mechanism that the alternative side can use is that they will say something like, well, maybe it was a bunch of smaller comets that were, broken up and it smashed into smaller areas and created, smaller craters in the ice, and that's why we don't find craters. Okay, fine, but the burden of proof is on them. Okay, you better figure out how to show me that that is what happened. All right, just because there's water action evidence on the North American continent, that does not mean that, smaller comets smashed into a theoretical ice sheet. That's purely cope. That's all that is. Right? There's nothing there. There is nothing there. Right? But this is what the alternative has. Now, the alternative goes further in trying to cope their way through this entire explanation. Is they'll try to say things like, well, the comets came in, they were made of ice, but lit all of the forests on fire, and so the fires melted the ice, and then started to extinct the large megafauna. It gets ridiculous. Like, both sides ultimately don't know what they're talking about. And the reason why both sides don't know what they're talking about is because they are both stuck in mainstream scientific mindsets. Right? They both are. The alternative side is just as guilty. I mean, they really are. There's no way around this. Right? They are still buying into the theory of uniformity, but they are willing to at least admit that maybe an impact took place. And it's funny, by the way. The reason why they focus on the impact as well is because that's all they have in their toolbox. An alternative mainstream scientist, generally speaking, they don't have anything else. They only have impacts. That's all they've got. They have no other scientific methodologies that they can use to explain the evidence that is right in front of their face. Even though the evidence that is right in front of their face very clearly shows a completely different scientific explanation that they could literally go and prove in their own garage through experimentation. Like, they could do it right now if they wanted to. Of course, this is ignored because psychologically in the West, we all have to believe in the theory of uniformity, and we all have to believe that, impacts are the only way to cause mass destruction. There cannot possibly be any other way to do any of this. The Ice Age either went away because the Earth, over hundreds of thousands of years just happened to, move in the wrong direction a little bit naturally. That's just its cycle, and that's what happened. Or there was an impact because an impact is the only thing that people are allowed to talk about without being ridiculed. Right? That's the situation. Whether you like it or not, that is what we are stuck with in the mainstream and in the alternative mainstream. And to make matters worse, right, we have people out there in the alternative mainstream, they're making careers out of these lies. Like, that's what they are. They're blatant lies. But they don't know they're lying. Right? Remember, I told you, psychologically, I can tell you why people believe in the Younger Dryas. It is a psychological condition. They have been conditioned their entire lives to believe in uniformitarianism, to believe in things like impacts and basic cosmology, and anything else outside of that realm of thought is not allowed. It is anathema to their existence. And the older the person is, the harder it is for them to break out of that. So right now we have an entire older generation right now, they're out there preaching about the Younger Dryas, and all these younger people are listening to them thinking that they are right. Now, why would people believe them? I mean, why would anybody believe this unless the evidence pointed in that direction? Because a Younger Dryas person, regardless if you're on the mainstream or alternative side, you do have evidence, right? There's evidence. There is a reason why you are championing this concept at all. And the only reason why is because there's evidence for it. Right? The mainstream doesn't like it because there's evidence for it. The alternative mainstream, they like it, but the evidence is still very alien to them with respect to their current mindset scientifically. Right? To be blunt, all these people are afraid to admit what the evidence is showing. Either consciously or subconsciously, they are genuinely scared to take that next step. And they know as well that if they take that next step, they will face ridicule. So, for example, there's that older generation right now out there who is preaching about, the Younger Dryas. And they're saying, oh yeah, Comet did this, and let me show you the evidence. And then everybody's like, oh wow, this is so scientific. These guys know what they're talking about. I mean, they've been doing this for decades. They must really know. All right, it's poisoning an entire generation. It's doing exactly what certain power structures on this planet want them to do. Like that's what they're doing. I don't know what else to tell people. Because if you believe in the Younger Dryas, you are not following the truth. And that is exactly what the people up there don't want you to do. Get away from the truth. And I know that sounds like conspiracy garbage, but it's the truth. What do you want from me? I'm not lying. If you were to start understanding real human history, your entire life right now would change. And if your life changes, that means their lives would change as well. And they love their lives. They have a lot of power. They live very well. Right? You don't, but they do. And they are not going to let that change. Okay. All right, so let's look at the evidence really quick. Let's bring up some of the evidence that both sides have to, kind of corroborate their side of their theory. Okay, you know what? It's funny. So I'll go over some of the evidence. There's a lot of evidence, actually. Let me just be right up front. There is a ton of scientific evidence that has been gathered by legit scientists, mainstream and alternative, that really do help paint a picture. The problem is that the picture that these guys are painting on the alternative and mainstream side is the Younger Dryas picture. And as I've already said, the Younger Dryas picture is completely 100% influenced by the way they've been forced to think their entire lives. They can't paint a different picture, even though the evidence shows something completely different. Okay, for example, all right, let's just talk about it. Okay, so there's all kinds of scientific evidence that supports something happening relative to water, and everybody agrees with that, about 10, 12, 13,000 years ago. Now, I'll be up front right now. Those dates are wrong as well, because the reality is we have no way to reliably date any of this stuff. Don't let anybody fool you at all, okay? There is no legitimate scientific way that we can conclusively say that something is dated to, say, 11,000 BC. There's no such way. We have no way of doing that. And yes, I realize that right now you can say, yes, but there's all these really intelligent scientific people who say that all the radiometric dating is right, and all of this other light dating and blah, dendrochronology and all this other garbage. It's all garbage, right? The number one thing that kills all of this is the calibration problem. It's the calibration problem, right? This is a problem that has not been solved by any dating methodology ever. Okay, that's a scientific fact. You cannot argue with me. There is a calibration problem. It has not been solved. It probably can never be solved. So the dates we are getting are completely ambiguous, and they are up to interpretation. And they are based on nothing but assumptions dressed in scientific lingo. For example, radiocarbon dating, there's legitimate science there. But we can't calibrate any of that, so we have to operate on assumptions. And so that's where all those dates come from. Okay. So for example, ice records or ice core records. Ice core records are one of the huge things that is used to try and substantiate the Ice Age and ultimately the Younger Dryas. Right? The problem with ice cores is insane. Right? We have once again, the calibration issue comes up. Right? We have no clue how old any of those actual ice core samples are. Right? They say, oh yeah, every layer is a year or a season or whatever. Okay, well, what about if there was a warm season and it melted and there was no ice that year? And what if it melted 2 or 3 years before that? Right? The problems go on and on. So when you get an ice core sample, it's not that an ice core sample isn't interesting, but you cannot use an ice core sample to date something back 10,000 years. It's not possible. It's not happening. It cannot be done. It's not happening. Right? There's no way to do it. And I'll talk about that on a different... I've already talked about it, but we're going to have to go over dating methodologies again, because we really need to understand the weaknesses of all of the dating methodologies. But anyway, so they'll look at an ice core sample and they'll say, well, there's a sharp drop in oxygen isotope ratios indicating a sudden cooling of 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Right? Interesting. And that may have happened. But we have no idea when it happened, and we have no idea of the gaps in between when it happened. Right? So you can say that, yes, it was a rapid onset and a rapid cooling, and they'll say something maybe within a decade, but that's the calibration issue. They don't know. They have no idea. It could have been within a month, for all we know. I don't know. They don't know. They're just relying on mainstream concepts. They are just relying on uniformitarianism to explain that. Okay? You can't do it. Another thing that they will use are lake sediment cores. Okay, once again, another scientifically interesting piece of evidence, but once again, the calibration problem comes into play, and we cannot rely on it. So what they'll say is, well, we show abrupt changes in things like varve layers, which those are essentially annual sediment bands, because once again, everybody just believes that, oh yeah, sediment just layers one on top of each other, and it never gets disturbed, and nothing happens to it, which means that it's 100% reliable. Right? That's not how that works. But they use that they'll use the evidence that looks good enough to support whatever part of their Younger Dryas claim they are trying to support. Now, interestingly enough, well, here, let's keep going. Okay, there's one other core that they will use as well, and that's ocean sediment cores. Once again, good evidence. But when they start to drill down into the various oceans, they do not find any consistency. So what they will do is they'll drill down into an area, and when they find a core sample that looks like it proves the Younger Dryas, they'll say, oh, this is from the Younger Dryas period. They don't actually know. They're just taking guesses. They are literally doing this this is like the most corrupt science you could do. They're just picking and choosing what works for them. Right? They'll do that, and then they go and they write a paper, and of course their friends will cite their paper, and then your average person is too stupid to know that mainstream science is just pulling everybody's chains so that they can make papers. And so eventually over the decades, what happens is that those papers, which were cherry-picking evidence against an already fallacious concept, it's now becoming a fact and not a theory. It shouldn't even be a theory. But this is what is happening. Now, another thing that they'll look at is pollen and plant fossils. And they generally look at these in Europe and North America. Now, the interesting thing about this evidence is that it really does show that there was some kind of massive vegetational retreat, I guess you could call it, because of a climate shift. The evidence really is there that something massive happened quickly. And just like the cores, there's evidence in the cores that also show that some pretty insane stuff happened. It's just not during the periods that they want to blame it on. Right? It's a complete misinterpretation of the evidence. Now, another thing that they found up there in North America, actually in Europe and even South America, and it's all over the place. And this is why the Ice Age is funny. But one of the things they discovered is that supposedly, as the glaciers pushed out, they create moraines, and that's true. Then scientists found that there was a supposed massive retreat of these glaciers, as they melted, and then for some weird reason, they re-advanced for a second, creating new glaciers, and then they went away or new moraines, and then they went away. So, the evidence for that is there, but the only interpretation they have are glaciers. Now, what's interesting about the glacial re-advancement part of that is that the answer for what actually happened is right in front of them, but they don't want to admit it. Right? They don't want to admit that the moraines with respect to glacial re-advancement is not about glaciers, but it's about the ebb and flow of one hell of a flood. Right? They don't want to admit that. They don't even entertain it. Okay. Anyway, they'll use cave formations as well. Basically, there's all this evidence out there that shows that something happened supposedly, between 10 and 15,000 years ago. Right? Another one that we need to talk about later later, is the black mat layer. And that's actually something I've been working on, which spawned this quick little outburst, because I think I figured out what the black mat is. And we'll do another show on that. But anyway, what's been found over time is that there's all kinds of evidence that something absolutely massive happened on this planet simultaneously, and it happened quickly, and it was massively destructive, right? But if we're going to keep running towards the Younger Dryas situation as an explanation, we're never going to figure out what actually happened. And I know people don't want to hear this, and I get that, because right now the Younger Dryas is the popular explanation. It sounds scientific. We have the older generation pushing it, so it must be real, right? We're doing the real science. The science is there. Well, what do you do if all of this science is being misinterpreted? Like, what do you do? Everything I've just said so far has, I've already sort of talked about, scientific misinterpretations by the alternative and the mainstream. It's right there. They're misinterpreting this stuff. They are ignoring the problems with their theory so that they can push their theory, right? They are ignoring all of the core sample problems. For example, right? They're ignoring the fact that ice core samples, that ocean sediment floor samples, and all those other core samples do not line up to anything like they should expect if what had happened with the Younger Dryas had actually happened in the way that they talk about. Right? It's an inconsistent situation that is relying on human interpretation to guess and put this stuff together and then say, oh yeah, I think that's what happened because that's my pet theory at the moment. That's all that's happening. Right? Okay. So, okay, more evidence. So there's very interesting situations with platinum and iridium. Now remember, I don't think the mainstream has an explanation for the radiometric anomalies. Okay, check this out. So one of the pieces of evidence that was discovered, especially in North America, during what they would call the Clovis time, that's a whole other garbage story. Anyway, but this layer, this is what seemed to have been terminated by the Ice Age ending, right? The Clovis layer up here in North America. What was discovered, interestingly enough, and this is a fact, is that in the Clovis layer we have a situation to where all the megafauna die out, right? They're all in there. This is where they're all stuck, the fossils and the bones and all of that. And we have a situation to where embedded in a lot of these fossils, and then in the rock layers themselves, in the sediment layers, we have radioactive material. And it was discovered that it really is only in this particular layer, in the layer that is attributed to this time frame that terminated the Ice Age. They also found things like little tiny nano diamonds. And interestingly enough, they actually found a lot of magnetic grains all throughout this layer. Now, the layers above it and the layers below it don't have the same volume of any of this stuff. So scientifically, that really does say something happened. That's legitimate science, right? So I'm on board with that. That's good evidence. And I don't know if mainstream has any real explanation as to why that layer has all of these anomalies. And of course, why, the termination of the megafauna and quite a lot of other humans happens at this very period of time. I pretty much, my guess is that they just say, well, some kind of a cosmological event happened, during the cycles, and that's what created that. And then, and then they run away, right? They don't have anything. They have nothing. Now, the alternative side, at least, is looking at this with a little bit more of an open mindset. But, like I said earlier, they're stuck with impacts. That's all they have. The mainstream alternative person has nothing else in their toolbox. So they have to be like, well, an impact can create nanodiamonds, yes. An impact might have brought magnetic grains with it. Yeah, possibly. I agree. Potentially. And it may have added plutonium and iridium anomalies to that layer. Right? And I agree, right? That's not unscientific. That's a possibility. The problem comes into play when you start to look at the way that all of this evidence is dispersed. it starts to not match any kind of an impact event in the sense or the way that we would think. Especially if you believe in the dirty snowball dust situation. The distribution of the material doesn't work. Now, mainstream alternative, they acknowledge this. This is a known problem. So one of the other coping mechanisms that they try to employ now is they try to say, well, maybe there was a supernova that happened a little before this, and maybe that's what triggered all this, and then the comet showed up, and that's why we have all the evidence that we have. Right? They're reaching for whatever they can find, because the evidence for the comet impact theory, it doesn't add up. It does not work. Sorry, I don't know what to tell people. The impacting theory for the Younger Dryas doesn't work. It's not there. The scientific evidence doesn't support it. And oddly enough, Younger Dryas researchers themselves admit this. Now, surface layer Dryas, Younger Dryas impact researchers don't admit this because they have no idea. Right? They're not looking at the in-depth evidence, because the in-depth evidence shows a different situation. So what the other scientists did is they said, yeah, there must have been a supernova that exploded somewhere, and Earth was in the shockwave, and all of that radioactive stuff hit us, and all of the magnetic dust hit us, and that's why we find everything where we find it, in the way that it's spread across the globe the way we see it. And potentially maybe that's also why the ice sheet started to melt. Their excuses just compound on themselves. It's absolutely hilarious. But this is what everybody does in the Younger Dryas community. They're just picking and choosing whatever works for whatever version of their Younger Dryas they happen to like. Right? The science does not support the Younger Dryas theory in any way, shape, or form. And the reality is, and the number one reason why it does not support it is because there's no evidence for an ice age. Right? There's no reason to believe there was a magical ice age that affected only one part of the planet, right, and had 2 to 3 mile high walls of ice and blah, blah, blah. Think about it like this. Okay, all right. Think about it like this. How many cultures on this planet have ever talked about running into a 2 to 3 mile high ice wall while they're migrating? How many cultures? Because I promise you, if I put you at the base of a 2 to 3 mile high wall of ice, you are going to be fairly impressed. And it's probably something you are going to write about at least once, right? Just maybe one time, right? You would write in your journal, well, we were migrating across the continents, and then we had to stop because there was a huge wall of ice in our way, and we had to turn around, right? And it's even funnier because if our ancestors were as stupid as the mainstream believes they were, they should have created some kind of an ice god. Right? The god of the ice wall. The god of, there's no such thing. Nobody has an ice wall god. Nobody cares about, nobody's writing about an ice wall. Nobody's mythologies have anything about ice whatsoever like that at all. It does not exist. Now, you can be like, yes, okay, fine. You should agree with me. You should agree with me because it's true. But then the next thing that alternative researchers will come back to me with is they will say, yes, but mythologies do sound like they talk about impacts or comets. And I 100% agree. And in fact, ancient mythologies describe comets, impacts, cosmological events that dwarf anything that the vast majority of people on the alternative side are prepared to handle. The stuff in the mythologies is absolutely nightmarish compared to anything the Younger Dryas is trying to conjure. The Younger Dryas is like baby talk for mythologies. It's nothing. It's nothing. It didn't happen. But, oh yeah, there was maybe a couple of small comet impacts. Oh, my sweet summer child. The reason... Yes, mythologies do indeed have impacts on this planet. And the Younger Dryas is nothing in comparison to what they actually describe. But nobody wants to acknowledge that. The alternative doesn't want to look at the mythologies, for example, if you're going to throw that back at me. If you're going to use, here's what another thing the alternative side does. I know I'm just kind of all over the place, but what the alternative side will do is they will look into the mythologies, but they will only go so far, right? They'll do exactly what they did with the scientific evidence. They will pick and choose out of the mythologies the events that works for the Younger Dryas in their opinion, and they will ignore everything else. So for example, one of the major mistakes that the alternative makes is that they lump together all of these flood stories, right? They say, oh, there must have just been one mega flood, and that's all it is, even though the mythologies themselves chronologically have two massive floods in two completely different kinds of ways. But the alternative will ignore this. They will lump them together because they have no respect for our ancestors. They think they're stupid. Oh, well, they must have really only been describing one flood. It must have happened during the Younger Dryas and 10,000 years ago and blah, 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 blah. That is what the alternative is doing. They are picking and choosing. The alternative is just as bad as the mainstream. Now, what is the truth? What actually happened? I've covered that on this channel already, right? And we'll continue to do it. But there is no such thing as an ice age. There is no such thing as the Younger Dryas. What happened on this planet is infinitely more insane than any of that. What happened on this planet is infinitely more destructive than the vast majority of people are ready to understand or accept. And the reason why is because they are afraid of the truth. They are afraid of what actually happened in their past. Facing the truth is something that the vast majority of us have been trained to run away from. And the Younger Dryas cope, that's all that is. It's pushing people in the wrong direction. So if you currently believe that the Younger Dryas is the explanation for the evidence that we currently see right now, you have a lot of proof to show us, because right now all the scientific evidence points to a completely different situation. And the evidence is here. Like, I don't have to theorize the Missoula Lake. I don't have to theorize, an ice crater or whatever. I don't have to do any of that. The evidence is right in front of us for what actually happened. And what actually happened was other planetary bodies came extremely close to Earth, and these bodies were electrically charged, and insane catastrophes took place, and our ancestors described all of them.